Alex hadn't thought of Warwood Elementary in years. After moving away, he figured that place and everything about it would be just a hazy memory. But over the past few months, he'd been having strange dreams, snapshots of old classrooms, children's laughter fading down dark halls, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. Warwood closed down shortly after he left, replaced with a new school on the same lot. The memory that surfaced the most wasn't one of the usual, carefree school days, but rather a rumor he and his friends used to whisper about, the bad chair. The older kids spoke of it in hushed tones. Supposedly hidden in a secret room beneath the teacher's lounge, it was reserved for students who got into serious trouble. But the story went that kids who went to the bad chair were never the same afterward. Some came back dazed, their memories fuzzy, their voices softer. A few kids, like a boy everyone called J-Boy, never came back at all. His absence wasn't officially mentioned. He'd just vanished, leaving behind only fragments of a story. The idea festered. As an adult, Alex knew how memories could twist things, but the dreams wouldn't stop. Each time he woke up, he felt a strange compulsion to confront whatever he'd left behind. One day, after finding himself searching online for old Warwood Elementary records, Alex decided to visit the new school built on the same grounds. Maybe a visit would silence these nagging memories. He reached out, and surprisingly, the new principal agreed to let him tour the place. He was even encouraged to bring someone along, so he asked Tony, his old childhood friend, who had also been at Warwood back then. Together, they'd faced the shadows of their memories. The school was still bright and welcoming on the outside, a modern brick structure with none of the old building's eerie charm. But stepping inside, something was oddly familiar. The principal, a polite but rather stiff woman, welcomed them warmly and spoke about the school's new beginnings. But when Alex mentioned the old faculty, her expression darkened, and she said that many of the Warwood staff had left suddenly about 15 years ago. When Tony, half-jokingly, asked if there'd been some scandal, she only muttered something about an incident with a student before changing the subject. The tour continued, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on them the deeper they went into the building. As they neared the teacher's lounge, Alex's chest tightened. The room looked almost identical to how he remembered it. Same light fixtures, same windows, the faint smell of chalk and stale coffee. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. The principal stepped in, her face pale, and told them this was a restricted area. Her tone was friendly enough, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort. The trio moved on, but Alex couldn't ignore the sense of unease crawling up his spine. Later that night, unable to let it go, Alex began digging into Warwood's history. He reached out to other old classmates, those he could track down, to ask about their memories of the place. Scotty, a former friend from those days, remembered how the school would sometimes go dark without warning and how doors would open and close on their own. He recounted an incident where he'd seen Steve, Alex's old friend who had fallen mysteriously ill, standing in the shadows of the gym after hours, looking wrong. His face was blank, his eyes hollow. When Scotty called out, Steve simply vanished into the darkness. Phil, another classmate, mentioned seeing teachers disappear behind a door in the teacher's lounge, one that he was certain didn't lead anywhere. and that reminded Alex of Steve's parting words: never look behind the teacher's lounge door. The more he thought about it, the more Alex remembered odd snippets, bits of conversation he'd overheard from the teachers, children who left the school in bad condition, and the sensation of being watched. His curiosity only grew, and he soon found old maintenance records suggesting there had been a hidden hallway connecting the teacher's lounge to an unused boiler room in the basement. The door was supposed to be sealed off, but it might still be accessible. It was all too much to ignore. Alex arranged a late-night return to the school, convincing Tony to join him, even though Tony was visibly uneasy. "It's just an old rumor," Tony muttered as they made their way through the empty school corridors. "We're grown-ups now. This is kid stuff." But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a rumor. When they reached the basement, they found the unmarked door that hadn't been on the blueprints of the new school. Pushing it open, they were greeted by a narrow, dark hallway that led them downward, deeper than they expected. Shadows seemed to move along the walls, twisting and shifting, and Alex thought he heard faint whispers. He brushed it off his nerves, but the sound grew louder, resembling the soft, indistinct murmur of children. He was filled with dread, but he pressed on, Tony following reluctantly behind him. At the end of the hall, they found a small, dimly lit room. There, in the center, was an old, wooden chair with worn leather straps and faint scorch marks on the armrests. The sight made Alex's blood run cold. Surrounding the chair were faded school photos, pictures of children he recognized: Scotty, Phil, Steve, and even J-Boy. Their images were faded and distorted, their faces twisted in expressions of horror. Tony took a step back, covering his mouth in horror. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. But Alex couldn't move. He was drawn to the chair, as if something was pulling him forward. He reached out and brushed his hand over the armrest, where he saw a symbol carved into the wood, a strange, twisted seal that looked eerily familiar. The moment he touched it, a sharp pain shot through his hand, and a flood of images overwhelmed him. He saw teachers gathered around the chair, their faces shadowed, chanting something in low voices. He saw children, strapped down, their faces contorted in fear as something dark and malevolent was bound into the chair. He felt the entity, its hunger, its insatiable need for the energy of the young. And he understood that the children's stories of the bad chair were far from just rumors. It was a place of ritual, a trap that bound a restless spirit, feeding off the memories and essence of its victims. Tony grabbed Alex, shouting that they needed to leave, breaking him from his trance. As they turned to run, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, coalescing into ghostly, childlike figures. Among them was Steve, his face twisted with fear, pointing toward the exit. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, forming words Alex could almost understand. "Don't stay." Steve's voice was barely audible, but his expression was one of desperate warning. They raced down the hall, feeling as though something was chasing them, a force that seemed to pull the air from their lungs. They barely made it out as the school alarms began to blare, and they staggered outside, gasping for breath. In the days that followed, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind in that basement, or that something had followed him out. Every night, he'd hear the sound of distant school bells, and one night, when he looked toward his bedroom doorway, he saw a shadow standing there. It was Steve, but his eyes were empty, his face locked in a hollow, haunting smile. Clutched in his hand was an old school photo that Alex didn't remember taking, showing his old class with Steve by his side. But in the photo, Steve's face was blurred, obscured by a dark, ghostly hand reaching over his shoulder. Alex understood now. The bad chair hadn't been a punishment, it was a conduit, a binding, a dark place that devoured innocence and memories, feeding on the young. And whatever it was, bound to that old chair, it was still hungry.